Today's webinar will be about 30 minutes in length. We're going to keep this one short and sweet. We will also be sharing a recording of this webinar later this week in case you wanted to relive your favorite webinar moments or share with a colleague. In terms of format, we're going to be splitting the time between our two speakers from InMobi and Kochava. Then things will transition to a short panel discussion with audience questions at the end. Speaking of questions, you will notice in your webinar panel a section for polls and questions. You can ask a question at any time, and we will try our best to answer them towards the end of the webinar. So to get things rolling, I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. We are joined by two industry experts on advertising fraud. From Kochava, we have Grant Simmons, Director of Client Analytics.
Hi.
Hey, Grant. And from InMobi, we have Raymond Bautista, Head of Strategic Partnerships. So without further ado, take it away, Raymond.
Thanks, JR. Hello, everyone. Regards from San Francisco. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm super pumped for this. Let's jump right into it. We're here to give the people what they want on ad fraud. First, they want to know who's actually at fault here. It's everyone. We're all at fault here. There's lots of finger pointing going on instead of working together to fight fraud and prevent potential abnormal activities. My motto is don't hate, collaborate. We're all victims here, and we need to work together in finding a cure for ad fraud and inject it into our ecosystem. Marketers lost about $7 billion to fraud last year. This year, we're projected to lose about $16 billion. That's an insane amount. In addition to this wasted ad revenue, the reputation of ad tech is questioned, the trust between marketers and ad partners are breached, and then a network can gain a reputation of being a bad actor and then loses on fraudulent traffic. As a marketer that relies on ad partners like InMobi to drive quality traffic to your app and relies on attribution tracking partners like Kochava to analyze that paid traffic, you know what it's like to experience traffic patterns that really doesn't make sense. And you question every click and every install, checking if it's for real. You then ask yourself, did it actually work? Was it my ad spend actually justified? Well, for ad networks, we share the same similar frustrations. In addition to misattribution, did you actually know that fraud really hurts a network's bottom line? They typically have to pay publishers in their network for the traffic before actually the advertisers are getting billed and reconciled against any detected fraud. So when marketers actually don't see what they like, I mean, they don't actually like what they see at the end of the campaign, they're actually not going to want to pay for traffic that already ran. So guess who's taking that L in the end? L as in loss. Not only are ad networks blindsided by fraud reports, but they're also expected to credit these marketers for traffic they already paid for. And by the way, guys, keep this on the down low, but there's actually marketers out there who are in a way enabling fraud by intentionally purchasing low quality traffic to gain more volume, but also want these premium placement, all the bells and whistles that come with it. I'm like, really? But everyone, let's move forward. Everyone continues to ask, what does fraud actually look like? And how do you know if it's really fraud, since anything that's abnormal is actually being rolled under fraud? Those are great questions because fraud is an ever-evolving beast. It's always changing. We find a cure for one type of fraud, and next thing you know, another one pops up. Back then, when campaigns were really focused on volume, the types of fraud included things like auto redirects, what else? Site bundling, cookie stuffing, click farms. Now, as the industry has evolved to focusing on post-install quality and ROI, fraud has also evolved. We have things that are called click injections, click spamming. Fraud is also imitating post-install user behavior and stealing organic installs and so on. It's pretty ridiculous, but it's nothing to sneeze at. In my opinion, the type of app install fraud that keeps me up at night, and probably others as well, is generated traffic by bots. And I'm not talking about Autobots and Decepticons here. We're talking about fake clicks and fake users. And why? Because it's really scalable and actually financially lucrative for these bad actors. These bots can be pretty straightforward. or super sophisticated by limiting real user behavior. And that's why this type of fraud is actually common. Oh, basically, I also want to mention, shout out to Grant Simmons from Kochava. He's actually providing more details on this in a few minutes. On the next slide, we believe fraud can be fought at the source. It's not really a last mile problem. Fraud actually starts much further upstream, and we define upstream as any action that occurs prior to the post-click phase, such as the ad networks, publisher onboarding, and runtime checks. If I'm an app marketer, things that I want to see addressed here's some key things. They should actually pay close attention to their data plus their user metrics, and also be careful about who they work with. It's pretty simple. They need to work with trusted partners that have a reputation in the market, vetting out their publishers in the network, analyzing their traffic that they detect, including those misattributions, plus be transparent where the ads are actually running. The most important step towards preventing ad fraud happens before actually the advertiser or the ad tracking partner ever gets involved. It's actually the network's publisher onboarding process. And here in InMobi, we call it the source level, where an ad network actually maintains these high standards of publisher quality. Here in InMobi, we actually have over 20 publisher onboarding checks, and that includes content quality and brand safety. Here's a couple questions that you could ask your ad partner if you're a marketer. I would ask them, hey, how much of your network's inventory is actually SDK integrated? Here in InMobi, 90% of our InMobi traffic is SDK integrated, where we have full control over ad delivery, experience, and interactions. I'll probably ask these ad networks other questions like, how do you verify your publishers? What's your checklist look like prior to launching a campaign? And maybe do you have a playbook or a Bible on how to run a performance campaign? The next level is called runtime, where ad networks should actually run, around-the-clock analysis on their traffic. And this includes discarding or eliminating this automated traffic by identifying these bots that I mentioned earlier through pattern analysis of impression and clicks in real time. As a marketer, you may want to ask your ad network partner, what type of ongoing analysis do you actually conduct? Like I mentioned earlier about paying a close attention to your data plus user metrics. If I'm a marketer, I'm going to ask myself and also the ad partner, how consistent are my actual metrics with each specific sub-publisher? And are they identical from day to day? These systems should be able to suggest the action that the ad network can take in order to stop traffic and investigate like which sub-publisher that's running your campaign. So I could actually just easily call out, hey, I see sub-publisher 57689. Let's go ahead and blacklist that for now so that we could have a more quality traffic being funneled to the client's way. And by the way, here's another pro tip. For marketers and ad partners to really develop a set of these fraud rules so they could automatically reject these debatable installs and specify them in their IO. For example, if this happens, then that happens. Those are fraud rules that you could have included in your IO if needed. The last level that we like to look at here in InMobi is where ad networks must really must work actually closely with these third-party attribution partners like Kochava to verify these measurement for increased transparency is actually there. And this includes really tracking the quality of installs and using fraud abatement tools like Kochava's Fraud Console. The most important part is full transparency with this data, reporting, pricing that you agreed upon, app install rules, and really transparency and ways of working together. And by the way, marketers and ad partners needs to really have access to a set of tools from these attribution partners that provide reporting in real time to really analyze these app install traffic in a granular level. So they could really detect fraud immediately, see if there's any fishy traffic patterns going on, and just view overall activity at a sub-publisher and a sub-campaign level. Side note, by the way, marketers, you can also consider working with a third-party anti-fraud partner to help really verify these devices, user agent, frequency of ad requests, and so forth, and compare that to known human behavior patterns. And my final note here is that we really need to make a change in how we can fight fraud together in this ecosystem. At InMobi, really recommend for marketers to really focus on quality over quantity. Go beyond that KPI of just looking at installs. We really believe that you should really shoot for the performance moon and not just fall into the stars. Keep in mind that when you're working with cheap rates for more volume, it's not ideal. We would rather have you focus on optimum acquisition costs and quality traffic model. And then for the ad networks like ourselves, we want to challenge ourselves to become more transparent and be able to track fraud at the source level. And in addition to that, provide cost to our advertisers to help them understand their run on ad spend. And for the publishers in our networks, I really challenge them to really put strict measures in place to protect the users and advertisers' best interests. Plus, integrate with these ad networks who are transparent and unbiased. And finally, for our tracking partners, we really recommend them to continue adding more rigorous checks and these anti-fraud measures in place as these different fraud types continue to evolve. Be able to stay ahead of these bad actors and isolate them. And my final note here to everyone is with marketers, ad partners like InMobi and tracking partners like Kochava working together in this walled garden, let's really educate each other to help identify these potential fraud from all the shared data that we're collecting so we can easily communicate concerns and stop them sooner than later. Plus, we'll be able to isolate and call out those bad actors. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, people, so let's work together on being transparent, share information moving forward, and win together. Hashtag teamwork. Next, I'm passing the mic to Grant Simmons, who is Kochava's resident expert in detecting fraud, and he's going to share his take on attribution fraud and the metrics behind it. What's up, Grant?
Hey there. Yeah, thanks for the handoff. You bring up an interesting aspect in terms of transparency, and if we look at networks, they see a much bigger app footprint than an attribution partner will see. The attribution partner, while they don't see every app, will see every network. And so if there is an appetite in the industry for transparency, I think there's lots of opportunities for each of us to potentially, pull back the curtain a little bit to allow access into other parties' data sets. And from that, I think we'll be able to capture a lot more of this stuff. So, it's going to be an interesting next couple years. The fraud isn't going to go away. It's going to get more sophisticated. But I do want to talk about what does fraud look like right now, at least through Kochava's lens. So if we want to advance the slide here. What is normal? Like what's a normal quote amount of fraud that we see right now? And if I look at the last 90 days, 15.4% of clicks are fraudulent and just over 4% of installs. And that isn't what's suspicious. That is traffic that is hitting known bad IPs, devices, or sub-publishers. We'll get into that a little bit deeper later, but the point is that those metrics are things you can hit with a hammer. That stuff is fraud. It isn't what is worthy of investigation. It isn't what it might be suspicious. It is, we would deem it definitively fraudulent. If we break down that number, the top 10 highest volume networks account for 84% of the click fraud and 27% of the install fraud. The point there is that the fraud isn't coming from smallish networks that nobody's ever heard of. The bulk of it's coming from the large sources. Having said that, though, there are specific networks whose total clicks are more than half are blacklisted, which is what we would consider definitively fraudulent. And we see dramatic differences across platforms. So we can, there's more than a couple examples where a particular network tends to be much more fraudulent on one platform than the other if we look at Android versus iOS. And there's some blurry lines in here, but I more or less characterize fraud into two camps. There's attribution fraud, whereby there's a legitimate install, but there's a certain amount of click or marketing activity meant to steal that legitimate install from either organic or from more qualified network sources. And the other camp is, and let's stay on this slide here for a sec, and then the other camp would be manufactured traffic and manufactured installs. And so that's kind of the bot stuff that was mentioned earlier. I won't stepwise walk through each of our fraud detection algorithms. I encourage anybody to get in touch with us and we can take a deep dive into all this stuff. But all in, we have about 16 different algorithms that we run against traffic to look for fraudulent behavior. Attribution fraud, it's made up of click spamming, click injection, click sniping. It's getting a little more sophisticated, but kind of the big camps are unreasonably high click to install rates, right? If you have a sub-publisher who is averaging 1 install for every 25,000 reported clicks, it's pretty reasonable that those probably aren't user-driven clicks. Those aren't users actually seeing an ad and clicking on it. And that tends to be kind of the most egregious, or at least the furthest reaching fraud tactic. Another form would be ad stacking, where the user does click a visible banner and it spawns click activity to multiple endpoints in hopes of any of those other apps that were stacked, if they're ever downloaded in the future, that sub-publisher would get credit. Also, there's unreasonably fast installs where, let's say you have a 100 megabit app and the time between the click, visit the App Store, download the app, launch the app, and wake up the SDK for that first time. If it's a 100 megabit app, generally, if you see a lot of installs coming in too quickly, you can generally look at click spamming as the culprit there. So a couple ways to detect it. We have a few more if we want to hop to the next slide. Another interesting form is click to install time distribution. So the graph on the left-hand side says that a user is much more likely to download the app 7 days after click than they are the day of the click, and that's, marketing just doesn't behave that way. So if you see a flat or inverted distribution, it generally bespeaks some form of attribution fraud. Or if you see a lot of traffic coming from relatively few IPs against a network or a site ID, that's generally worthy of investigation as well. So this isn't the inclusive list of all the attribution fraud that we try to detect, but it at least provides a little bit of a sample. If we look at manufactured traffic, which is kind of the next big camp that I think of when it comes to fraud, we can advance the slide here. Devices with high click volume is definitely an indicator where if you have a single, in this case, single Android device that over a 30-day period has clicked an ad 60,000 times, probably not a human being doing that, because their thumbs would fall off. Another example would be mean time to install, in that, is there a sub-publisher who is behaving so much differently than the network average? That's very interesting to investigate, in that if you were to isolate that one site ID that is behaving so much different than the network mean, if you look for, let's say, post-install events against that install cohort, oftentimes there's been no activity in the app. And then another one is anonymous installs, in that the IP of the installed device is coming from like a Tor node or a VPN or a proxy. There's been an attempt to try to anonymize the source of that install. And again, if you look at post-install events against that stuff, it generally looks pretty bad. So, we take all this stuff and break it up into, well, let's monitor it, and then let's provide advertisers with the tools to help mitigate on the front end. So if we advance the slide here, I think of this as two things, in that you've got detection and mitigation. So, at Kochava, we have the reporting console, and that is specific to a client's account in all of their apps and all of their networks and sub-publishers. Provides really good visibility into statistical outliers and can hone in on stuff that's worthy of investigation. that's really good, except for, you know, I think I shudder to think of how much time is spent on clawbacks and make goods and getting on the phone with the network and potentially the attribution partner as well, and trying to win back dollars which were likely against fraudulent sources. So based on that, we built the blacklist. What the blacklist is it's if we observe the same behavior across multiple accounts and apps, we run this stuff at higher thresholds. The point there is that if a site ID, a device, or an IP has been blacklisted, it really has to earn its right to be there. That's stuff that we deem remarkably dangerous. And it's a dynamic XREF, so it's constantly updating on a rolling window. So, you know, devices, IPs, and site IDs can roll on and off the blacklist. So there's a dynamic aspect to it, but it is more stringent than what's reported in the console. And the advertiser has some choices here. They can turn this on in listening mode just to get a sense of what percent of their traffic is deemed ultimately dirty, or they can choose to not even attribute to begin with. I think one of the critical functions here, and we've got a lot of marketers who are using it, is if they're subscribing to the blacklist, as they are going through the console and see site IDs, for instance, that are not necessarily blacklisted, but tend to be very fraudulent against their account or apps, they have the ability to add that site to the blacklist as well. And so that creates their curated blacklist and appends that site ID to the overall. So that's how we're trying to deal with kind of the upfront mitigation. And you know, it's been met fairly well in the market. If you're interested, again, I'm happy to take a deep dive into all this stuff with anybody who wants to learn more. The other thing I'd like to talk about, and I'm sure, you know, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but you know, I've got some thoughts here. If we want to advance the slide, on why do we see so much fraud to begin with? And not to date myself too much, but if I look at, you know, how you know, predominant the fraud is in the mobile app industry, to me it feels a lot like affiliate marketing circa like 2001, where you'd see a bunch of sketchy stuff like browser toolbars for cookie stuffing, and it's just, why is there this much fraud to begin with? And so I've got a theory, and I would, you know, I'm welcome to hearing dissenting opinions on this. But again, attribution fraud is about 70% of what we detect, and I argue that this industry that we sit in demands instant feedback loops. So marketers want to have an adorned winner in darn near real time. So we're talking, you know, closing that loop in 100 milliseconds. There isn't a lot of appetite to have fractional allocation because they need to make decisions on a programmatic basis in near real time. And so by and large, you know, the industry rewards last click. You know, there's tons of waterfall logic and configurable attribution windows and lots of ways that you can hone in on what you think the most precise signal is that led to a download. But unfortunately, and I think this is really hamstringing networks in particular, if I think of a user acquisition function, meaning you want to try to get that offer in front of as many worthwhile prospects as possible, networks should be maximizing reach. And in my prior life, I was the head of retail analytics at Oracle, and we did lots of studies that looked at incremental lift by campaign. And if you had enough data, you could look at incremental lift by impression. And what we would invariably find was the first impression served to a potential prospect actually does the most incremental work. And so I argue that the goal of networks should be to serve as many first impressions as possible. However, the dynamics of the industry reward last interaction, and I think to some extent this is resulting in this click spamming that everybody's witnessing. And not to say that, we should all throw our hands up and say that, well, why should I do any attribution, or why should I be running ads at all? There's a ton of value in collecting all of the touch points leading to an install. And I would argue, if I was an advertiser, I would demand that all of my network partners not only report clicks, but impressions as well, because to some extent, those impressions are doing work, even if the industry itself is attenuated to last click. And so, we could talk about multi-touch attribution. That won't completely mitigate fraud, but I've built a couple MTA models for clients to use on an ad hoc basis that does a couple things. It looks at all of the campaign interaction touch points and all the networks that are leading to all of the installs, and to what extent are those network partners unique, and that unique traffic, is it better or worse than average, for instance. So one interesting way to try to tackle this is to say, well, let's build a model that rewards unique reach and good quality, and from that you can generate coefficients at the network level or the sub-publisher level that will dial up or down the value of an install brought to you by a network. So I think that would go a pretty far way in terms of potentially mitigating this stuff. Ideally, we would do incremental measurement. For lots of interesting reasons, that's remarkably difficult to do right in digital, and even more so in mobile. But we've challenged ourselves at Kochava to say, hey, are there better ways to measure this stuff that can adorn credit through the entire experience of leading to an install, instead of just that last point? So I think this is going to be a pretty big focus in the coming months, and I hope to have something in market, at least in a beta sense, in the next couple quarters. So with that, I know we got a couple minutes left. I want to open it up to any questions we have.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. We got a couple questions from the audience. I think we got time for maybe two here. First question, is the fraud blacklist transparent to advertisers? I imagine that goes to you, Grant.
Transparent in that we don't publicly publish the thresholds and exactly how we're munging on the back end. In terms of the specific device IDs, IPs, and site IDs that are in it, that is something we've disclosed in the past.
Great. Next question. What are some of the less common types of fraud? Hitting an MMP's endpoint to mimic an install, for example.
Yeah, the less common, the sophistication of this stuff is somewhat remarkable. And even though the toughest stuff to detect is the stuff that's sprinkled in, meaning if you could identify a sub-publisher and 100% of their installs all fit some statistical criteria in terms of fraud, that's an easy call. It's a lot less easy when only 20% of their traffic is, and at that point you have to start kind of following that thread upstream. Some of the more interesting types I've seen lately are there's obvious scripts out there that will inject a click, look like an install, make a registration event with an email, and then go dark forever. And if you get the unhashed emails, it looks like the email portion of that's being scripted as well. So it looks like, in all intents and purposes, if that marketer cares about the registration event, all those installs look great, but there's not an actual device behind them. And I've seen the same thing where they'll script a 99-cent purchase and then go dark, and then that will now throw a purchase event, making that install base look really good, but again, there's no actual device behind it. So there's small cases that are, I'll say, particularly evil. We've tried to ferret that stuff out at scale. It's the smallish stuff that, do we have a way, or can we come up with a way to detect it such that so that it'll work for everybody. And that's kind of an ongoing challenge.
Great. So we're just about out of time here. I want to ask one last question, quick answers from both of you. Where do you see fraud 12 months from now? What's the future of fraud? I'm going to throw it over to Raymond here.
Yeah. So how I really see the fraud landscape the next 12 months from now. It's really bad actors will continue to adapt and evolve. They're going where the money is, and we should be prepared for that. If we invest in automated fraud detection and eliminate these fragmented tools, we'll actually pay off dividends as fraud becomes more sophisticated. I really believe that here at InMobi that we've invested in fraud abatement tools and work with our partners such as Kochava. We have machine learning programs and manpower that are constantly being fed with new fraud indicators, which in turn is going to allow us to flag and investigate these abnormal activities. So my suggestion is, as of today and how we move forward, let's work smarter, not harder.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, it's going to be, fraud's going to get a lot more sophisticated in that. If we think of the low-hanging fruit that is hitting much of it, it's attribution fraud. So, it's unreasonably low conversion rates, things like that, stuff that's pretty easy to detect, and advertisers and networks can to some extent figure that out on their own. But it will get more sophisticated, and so can we stay ahead of that curve? I think one thing that will lend itself to staying ahead of the curve is the transparency we had talked about earlier. If we have in the industry start sharing data, we can ferret this stuff out a lot quicker. So not necessarily a call to arms, but I'm certainly interested to have those conversations.
Excellent. All right, well, we're a few minutes over, guys, but I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Like I mentioned, we're going to be sending out a recording of this webinar later this week, so stay tuned for that. Other than that, guys, go on, fight fraud, and together we can win this thing. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.